Many old moons ago, tens of thousands of them, in the glass of Horus, even as they stood looking from their own today, there lived a queen called Kheperer, the one of the Scarabaeus sucker, who rolls the sun around like a globe of dung in the endless desert of far more moon pebbles than time could ever let pass. Thus she was the one who emerged from herself. The dung sun by and of her made an egg from which she crawled forth. Being found in the appearance of God, she sought to create a structure of mathematical riddles to lay claim to the origin of creation. The great seal which impresses, informs, leaves a sign on all that which is to be signified. Just like Darwin, in every tale of evolution, a priest of hers realized through standard unmediated empiricism that amphibians, frogs in particular, constituted a living proof of that major hoop which life had to hop through to reach earth from water. They give birth in wetness, but live among those which are dry, though cold to the touch, just like the snake. So she calculated 4 pairs of frogs, those self-born uncreated beings as well as snakes, the bearer of one of the most original forms. Nun, the depth of waters of the primordial proto-ocean, the black backdrop onto which He, the formlessness and limitlessness of non-being, signified itself, signified androgynously as a bound double helix, for those who could read in latter times when no one was left to tell this story. Furthermore, Kuk and Tenemu, darkness and perfect disorder, as 4 pairs make 8, all-inclusiveness and all-encompassing wholeness, for multiplication is amplification, and Kheperer wanted to be heard throughout the eons, her reign not to end before her echo. 100,000 depicted as a baby frog became 1 million. 1 million that is He, depicted as a bowing subject. And maybe one really ought about such magnitude rather than being a spawned slimy marble. For one really shouldn't count one's subject in any greater numbers. After all, how many pebbles before you once again see nothing but the evil desert? The activity of these 8, the pair of 4, is not actually a positively describable action in the proper sense of the word, but a mere presence defining the less than nothing in which our being is born. And are we not still bowing to this echo, the indefinite hyperbolic numerals of the second millennium's nucleobase, which nonetheless are pairs of 4 letters, A, C, G, and T, embracing each other and twined to form that chain of acid which has replaced the thread of the fates, the spinner, the allotter, and the inevitable of past, present, and future. If so, then why did our old queen of the amphibian double helix claim all those ages ago that once the eightfold have drawn breath, the Ogdoad, as they are known, are meaningless? The birth of the here on out causal one. You and me as sentient beings doing things. In her words, deactivates the non-existence, ceases its activity permanently, negates the negation. That is why they are referred to as the deceased primordial, which does not express the idea of death in the sense of the end of the existence of the existing ones, but their inactivity, immobility, and rest. And rest they will until our conscious actions call on them. For indeed, when Rosalind Franklin had that famous photo 51 developed, the proof which would give Watson, Crick, and Wilkins their Nobel Prize a decade later, even though they somehow forgot to mention her. It was a photo of dead DNA. A pile of bones, if you like. So wise then was Scheffrer, she the one of the long nights of Thoth, the immaculate desert where the forlorn, past, astral light shines without pollution, pretending to be alive though extinguished before the observer came to be, that she didn't bother with tales of creation, but instead gave origin and beginning a riddle. To overcome the thanathological fetish which we continue to worship. A mathematical problem, a suit of fourfold discrete functions, a tetralemma worthy of the Sphinx, which Buddhas before the Buddha called Kautscotti in the eastern lands that greeted Pharos when he came to visit gymnosophists and the Magi during the bloodbaths of Alexander, only to bring back to Europe the tradition of skepticism. As said Nagarunya, the tamer of thought serpents, what is the fourth way? Here the white coats and robes are dull and stupid. Because of their dullness and stupidity, when he is questioned, he resorts to evasive statements and wriggles like an eel. If you ask me whether love guides evolution, but I don't say so, and I don't say otherwise, and I don't say it is not, and I do not say it is not. Is there no love guiding evolution? Is there both love in evolution and no love in evolution? Is there neither love in evolution nor love in evolution? Are there spontaneously born beings? Are there not both, neither? Does the awakened one exist after death? Do they not exist after death? Do they both exist and not exist after death? Do they neither exist nor not exist after death? If I thought so, I would say so. I don't say so. I don't say it is not. This is the fourth case. For I am not a deterministic defeatist. I am with those who awaits the dawn of the new world when the undomesticated in our blood hears our crying and regain their proper place in nature.
I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. I suppose we all thought that, one way or another.
Hello and welcome to the return of the repressed. Sorry for the delay, dear listeners. I'm very sorry. Yet today we are sitting down to tell the story of Paul Kammerer. I think we have reached a point in the arch story of ecofascism where this case will make proper sense. Even though I obviously think one needs to listen to the other episodes about Lysenko to really follow along, I have decided to try to make this episode, or maybe a pair of episodes, somewhat standalone and unlock it for the public. But if you want to know where we are coming from and where we are going, please sign up to the Patreon. It's inexpensive and well worth it. And you will also be supporting my ongoing Satoyama natural farming project of saving heirloom varieties in the Japanese Alps, which I have posted a small video about. This is the only thing that really, the minute object and the cause of my alternative fantasy, which makes it possible for me to spend my awakened and unawakened time exploring the fascist crimes against nature which surrounds us all the fucking time. It wouldn't be possible without it. If I didn't do this, I would be selling you some fucking rare earth additives or, some probiotic or prebiotic, supplements that I am so sure of, in, their they would take care of you, right? I'm so worried about this because I saw recently, actually I saw this about a few years ago, one of the best speakers, in my opinion, about this contemporary farce and predicament. I can't remember his name right now, but a Dr. Bush something. Oh yeah, Zach Bush, right? The initial reason for my, getting interested in him was that I thought he was helping farmers in America, right? And he seems to be doing that. But then I sort of went further, obviously, and I looked at some of his sort of sister projects, and I found this particular website where his sort of big story was outlined, the one that he doesn't, he provides this story in bits and pieces to other podcasts like the Gook Project, is it called that, by Gwyneth Paltrow, and other, sort of well-being hippie, post-hippie, holistic, take care of it all people, where they provide, their alarmist message, and then they provide their solution, right? Which is a capitalist solution. What do we expect? But this was what was particularly disturbing about this particular homepage, was that it was a series, I think, of 3 or 4 documentary episodes, each maybe 1 to 2 hours long. And when you did have, you had to sign up. I didn't actually sign up, but I managed to sort of get hold of a few of the episodes, in the pirate way. But for the normies, they would have signed up to this streaming service, and they would have been exposed to these documentaries, and you could only watch them with 1 day's interlude. So basically you would have had 4 days of watching 2 hours of extreme alarmism, and then you would have been directed to sights of solution once you live through this task, this in a way heroic task. I'm sure they did put forward quite a lot of truths in this session of message, but this insistence, right, like this repetition and this concentrated, not quite sure actually what to call it psychoanalytically. I have to go through this later, but yeah, I'm sure you can understand what I'm talking about. That this is the way of the capitalist when they want to speak about our contemporary problems. They want to make quite a few bucks out of our sorrow and sadness. Now instead, in opposition, in this episode, I will primarily be guided by an Austrian investigative journalist and science writer named Klaus Taschwer, who has done a remarkable job of shedding some new light on this old mysterious case, which connects in more ways than I could have ever imagined to the story which we have been journeying on through for much of the year so far. I really want to sort of pinpoint this point, which is that, Karl Taschwer has done the vast majority of the detective work for this story. Even though I do provide some sort of political context, I'm connecting it to a grander picture. I'm translating his German to English, and I'm providing it in podcast format for English listeners. So I've done something, but really, if you want to know the truth story, the whole story, try to get a hold of his book and read it, because man, he's done so much good work. And I'm saying this because I'm going to be quoting him quite a lot, and I'm following quite rigorously the storyline that he does put forward. Now, with that being said, let's let's go through a little bit about what that might entail. Well, to start off, to grab his readers' interests, Taschwer opens up with his investigation with the last day of Kammerer's life. So how about we do the exact same thing then? Grab your walking stick, your lederhosen, and mass, dear listeners, and come with me now to the Alp peaks of what was once the Holy Roman Empire, which saw its second final defeat in the days of our main character, as a new empire rose to the fore across the pond in the New World, and with it new perceptions and truths. It is the fateful year of 1926, and a 46-year-old biologist leaves his hometown of Vienna, taking the train to Pushberg am Sachenberg. 4 castles were built here in the high Middle Ages, of which now only ruins remain, along an old once Roman road for the transport of grains, wine, and salt. Paul Kammerer has stayed in the spa town many times before. He checks in at the Hotel Road in late summer. The next morning, as the mountains invite him for his last hike, autumn has already begun. He heads for Himberg, a steep hill at the eastern end of town. The trail starts at the hotel that is now called the Schneeberghof and leads across a stream, then climbing in a steep zigzagging serpentine up the Himberg. After about half an hour's hike through the Föhrenwald forest, a downhill path branches off to the right, which ends a few minutes later at the Theresienfelsen. From these cliffs one has a splendid view out to the Schneeberg, the easternmost of the Alpine peaks over 6,500 feet, and down to Puschberg. Around 2 p.m., Johann Lechner, a retired railroader, heard loud barking from the direction of the Theresienfelsen. A local from the neighboring village of Neunkirchen. He had been out doing trail repairs on the Himberg, and when he got to the lookout, Lechner discovered a man lying next to the dogs, his lifeless body leaning up against a rock. In shock, Lechner hurried down to the village and contacted the community physician, Dr. Kerbel, and the local police, who then arrived at the scene about an hour later. The dogs seemed to be guarding the corpse of their companion, and at least one of them at first didn't let anyone approach the body. There was a revolver in the dead man's right hand, yet it appeared that he had reached over and shot himself in the head above his left ear. The bullet left the right side of his head and also destroyed a part of the eye. Thus, from a forensic perspective, the scene with the revolver in his right hand and the bullet's point of entry on the left definitely needed some clarification. But then murder is ruled out, as a letter is found in the pocket of the jacket. Quote, "To the person who finds my body. Dr. Paul Kammerer requests that he not be transported home, since his family should be spared the sight. The most simple and inexpensive solution might be utilized in the dissection room of an academic institute at a university. This would be the most preferable to me, as that would at least allow me to be of some service to science. The valued colleagues might find a trace of something in my brain that was missing from the live statements of my intellectual activities. Whatever is done with the cadaver, whether buried, cremated, or dissected, its owner is unaffiliated with any religion and wishes to remain spared of any religious ceremonies, which would probably be refused him in any case. This is not meant to express any hostilities toward individual priests, who are people like all others, and often good and noble people at that." End of quote. Already the next morning, the Neue Freie Presse, Austria's only internationally renowned daily, reported of the scientist's surprising and puzzling suicide. Quote, "A shocking piece of news reaches us at a late evening hour. The outstanding biologist, Dr. Paul Kammerer, whose books and essays on biological and sociological subjects have justifiably attracted great attention, and who has always drawn enthusiastic audiences in the hundreds in Vienna's lecture halls, has committed suicide. The letters he has left behind do not offer any complete clarification as to the reason for this fateful decision." End of quote. Following this article, an unnamed Viennese biologist acknowledged in length the scientific significance of Paul Kammerer, which, quote, "was not limited to his virtually amazing knowledge in all areas of natural science, but also apply to his ability to present his knowledge in a generally understandable way. End of quote. At the Institute of Experimental Biology, where Kammerer had worked since its founding in 1903, a number of sensational articles originated, usually dealing with the inheritance of acquired characteristics, which immediately made Kammerer's name known in the entire scientific world. He had no lack of friends, nor of enemies. His longing to receive an official, professorial chair in Vienna was not fulfilled, unfortunately, and to his great disappointment. But he had been given a professorship in the Soviet Union only a few months earlier. And indeed, one of his farewell letters was addressed to the Soviet embassy in Vienna, and yet another to his wife. The New York Times, which some 3 years earlier had acknowledged Kammerer in several articles as the quote-unquote second Darwin and quote-unquote Darwin's successor, published a longer obituary only 2 days after his suicide. The researcher, it said there, was part of an unorthodox scientific school. Quote, but the orthodox scientific circles did not accept his theories, frowned on his socialism, opposed his aim of popularizing scientific knowledge, and for these reasons prevented fulfillment of his dream of becoming a professor in Vienna. End of quote. Here we get perhaps a hint of the motive for his death. But initially, as the Habsburg capital is perhaps Europe's most well-documented site of upper-class intrigues and gossip, thanks to Freud and his colleagues, it was assumed that a broken heart was the cause. Kammerer, having been divorced twice, was well known for his problematic, passionate romantic love life. But one of Kammerer's earlier students, journalist and biologist Walter Finkler, denied the speculations about Kammerer's private life in an article in the daily Neues Wiener Journal. Quote, forget the intimate bedroom intrigues. They were not the motive for his suicide, but at most an important contributing factor. The conflict went far deeper and was more noble. He died a hero's death in the futile struggle against rubbish, barricades, and traditional demons. End of quote. Finkler goes on to tell us that Kammerer's animal testing had struck, quote, the ink and paper edifice of all printed theories on evolution like a bolt of lightning. End of quote. Namely, he managed to prove, quote, that external factors can have lasting influence on instincts and the structure of a living being, so that these newly acquired traits can be inherited by the non-influenced offspring. End of quote. Thanks to Kammerer's experiments, blind Olms had acquired functioning eyes. Fire salamanders acquired additional spots and stripes, and midwife toads, Alytes obstresians, acquired so-called nuptial pads, which they did not ordinarily have. The scientific experiments made Kammerer into a political sensation overnight, since they jeopardized, quote, the doctrine of the inviolability of racial traits, or the absoluteness of race, or of the omnipotence of selection, the theory of the necessity of genocide as a factor of selection. End of quote. Again, I'm pretty sure that's Finkler's quote. We have to ask then, as have many since the 20s, if there might have been a political background to Kammerer's death. Friend and poet Peter Sturmbusch wrote in verse, quote, "Paul Kammerer was the freest scholar in the country. But what use this freedom for him in Kreinwinkel? Our alma mater, which otherwise so benevolent, wanted to know nothing of its best son, who was different from all the other, tamer sons. It is a wise mother who knows and recognizes her child. Our alma mater was not that wise. To be a genius in this country is forbidden by church and state. Seek another fatherland for your spirit, for here only idiots do you rejuvenate. They refused to make you a professor, polite as the rejection was. You are not fitting for our faculty, you are much too distinguished for us. A human heart beats in your works, with love sometimes darting through your mind, and nature feels you have recognized her, secretly placing flowers in your parlor." Ten years later, in 1936, Sturmbusch would also kill himself right in front of the gathered dignitaries of the League of Nations, who in his opinion seemed naive or oblivious when faced with the crimes of the Neue Deutsche Reich. After Kammerer's funeral, Pravda published a farewell letter that he had sent to the Presidium of the Communist Academy. The letter was considered so significant that it was sent out on the wire by the Central News Service and the international press correspondence, which led to a wave of reports even in Australian, American, and British newspapers and magazines. In the letter, Kammerer wrote to his Moscow colleagues on the day before he took his life. He wrote, quote, "You probably all know about the attack that Professor G.K. Noble waged against me in the August 7th, 1926 issue of Nature. This attack is based on an examination of my evidence specimens of alytes with nupital pads, which Dr. Noble conducted along with Professor Bram, with my consent, in the Institute of Experimental Biology in Vienna. The main matter is an artificial coloration, probably from ink dye, through which the black skin coloring of the region with the nupital pad was supposedly feigned. It is claimed to be a falsification that will presumably be blamed on me. I found Dr. Noble's statement to be completely confirmed. Yes, there were also other objects, blackened salamander, in which my results were evidently improved, quote within quote, post-mortally with ink. Who besides me would have an interest in making such manipulations can only be very remotely presumed. What is certain is that it casts doubt on just about my entire life work. Due to this state of affairs, I can no longer view myself to be the man suited to accept your offer of a professorship, although I was not at all involved in the falsification of my specimens. However, I do not see myself in a position to endure the destruction of my life work, and I hope I can muster sufficient courage and strength to put an end to my failed life tomorrow." End of quote. He also informed the addressant that he wanted the Communist Academy in Moscow to receive his entire library, quote, thereby being reimbursed for payments that it wasted on me, end of quote.
Jedes Kind schmiedet Gesetze in einer viel zu alten Welt. Konfrontiert mit Gegensätzen, wo Vernunft vor Regeln fällt. Küsst doch Weiber oder Kerle, Liebe erkennt man am Geschmack. Jeder Depp kann Hass verlernen, wenn den Willen dazu hat. Und du bittest mich, kein Gott zu sein, denn es war schon gut mit deiner goldenen Regel. Oh, oh, oh. Mit deiner goldenen Regel. Oh, oh, oh. Ich schläfe meine Philosophie, ja, Philosophie. Ich schläfe meine Philosophie, ja, Philosophie. Muss nur der Zukunft ein Versprechen, wer Geschichte nervt und schnell vergeht. Wird dein Standard bald entsprechen, wenn du geduldig mit mir bist. Und du bittest mich, kein Gott zu sein, denn es war schon gut mit deiner goldenen Regel. Oh, oh, oh. Mit deiner goldenen Regel. Oh, oh, oh. Ich schläfe meine Philosophie, ja, Philosophie. Ich schläfe meine Philosophie, ja, Philosophie. Für mich nicht in Versuchung, aber für mich hinters Licht. Yeah. Oh, oh.
As Klaus Taschwer, our Austrian investigator, points out, this letter caused the discussion about the motives for Kammerer's suicide to suddenly turn, in public as well as in the scientific community. Even though the letter contains no admissions of guilt or even intimations in this direction. Nevertheless, all of a sudden Kammerer was no longer seen as a victim of problems in his private relationships or of the disrespect of the University of Vienna. Instead, he was now suspected of being a falsifier, whose suicide was seen as an admission of guilt. In American tabloids, the case was even hyped into sensational front-page stories. The basic tenor of the articles was that Kammerer must have performed the manipulations himself, therefore responding with the only possible reaction once it was discovered. This seems to be very much the general take until this day, but as we will see, it was also in the Anglo-American world that we find some of Kammerer's worst adversaries. They did not like that Kammerer had forced one of the few species of toads that reproduces on land and not in water to suddenly mate in water. This caused the males to develop nuptial pads, as are common in other species of frog. These pads assist the males in gripping the slippery female in the water during copulation. Love handles, I guess we would call them. Kammerer claimed that not only was he able to get the males to develop these nuptial pads, but that they were also passed on to the next generation. Which, sort of means that it's more like love gloves or something. This evidence of the heritability of acquired characteristics became the subject of a scientific dispute that had been going on for many years and even today. As I am sure some of you listeners can tell, the evidence is also particularly problematically related to the so-called Dollo's law of irreversibility, initially popular among paleontologists. As Belgian, Louis Dollo was a paleontologist whom, together with a certain Austrian named Othenio Abel, were very busy at the time in establishing the hard ground principles of paleobiology. I'm not, assuming that you all knew about all of that, but the law of irreversibility, even if you did not know about Dollo, seems to be a pretty common assumption among generic interpretations of evolution. And it is primarily this larger group of paleontologists which will recur as the most interesting in our investigation. Indeed, the by Kammerer aforementioned Gladwin Kingsley Noble, who brought forth the accusations and supposed proof of Kammerer's forgery, worked for the world's most famous paleontologist, the baptizer of both Tyrannosaurus rex and the Velociraptor, as well as president of the American Museum of Natural History, Henry Fairfield Osborn. Osborn, whom inspired by his own physico-chemical theory of evolution, known as Aristogenesis, was also the co-founder of the American eugenist movement. But there seems to be no proof that Osborn ever met Kammerer, so we will have to return to this lead in a while. As the American mass reproduced opinion that a letter to Moscow was a sign of admission of guilt started to gain momentum, Hans Prissibram, director of the Biological Research Institute in Vienna and presumably the person most knowledgeable about his former staff members' research, offered the following suggestions to a reporter from the newspaper. Quote, "It would be a blatant misunderstanding to read Paul Kammerer's farewell letter to be a self-incrimination. I find it absolutely mystifying who could be responsible for the artificial coloration of the nuptial pads of the midwife toad, as had been determined by Professor Noble. Because the related experiments by Kammerer go back many years. It is almost impossible today to determine who was to blame. Because Kammerer realized that the matter would probably never be resolved, he evidently was tired of the much undeserved hostility. and ended his life. End of quote. A short time later, two journalists, the most famous German-speaking journalists of the time, took on the case, creating a second wave of interest, which, as second wave tends to do when born too soon, invented a lot of made-up statements by Kammerer. The obituaries by the famous authors summarize once again the two positions that initially framed the discussion. Before suspicions over the course of time strangely settled on Kammerer as the falsifier and his suicide as the self-evident admission of guilt. As a final defense, trying to put the question in the political context of its own time, the Austrian literary giant Karl Kraus wrote in his typical aphoristic style, quote, "For philosophy, Lessing's words suffice, quote, the Jew is to be burnt," end of quote. Which I'll add, Marcus here, is a reference to the first European dramaturg Gotthold Ephraim Lessing's play Nathan the Wise, a plea for religious tolerance which would lead to the Sturm und Drang movement's rejection of the French aristocratic theatre dogmas during the era of its loss of hegemonic power in the latter 1700s, no longer the structurer of the major class ideological medium of its time. Going on. For jurisprudence, the Inquisition law, the Kammerers do not die only due to the barriers of the night owls of scholarship, but also from the indifference of those of the light of day who prefer owls to eagles. Proper science despises people like Kammerer because they are too rash, because they need to run from a miracle before they have proven it beyond the last shadow of a doubt. This science does not understand that the best of its sons need to eat bread hot out of the oven, that they cannot wait until it gets stale, that they need their teeth in order to clench them in anger, but not to break them out on old insights. End of quote. But Kraus, despite his serious literary talent, wrote in vain. The mood had clearly shifted against the Jewish neo-Lamarckian, even if virtually all questions remained open. As we know, only the Soviet Union and Lunacharsky kept the flame alive, but indeed, again, as we know, their approach was also on the way out, soon to be replaced by the modus operandi of Koltsov and Serebrovsky, who had received funding from Rockefeller. Now, dear listener, it is time for us to get some more meat on our bones. For Paul Kammerer really lived a life, and many years before Lysenko, he fought the fascist reductionists' hypothesis, mostly alone, poor and ridiculed, despite perhaps a very passionate love life, which on its own would be on par with Goethean heroes as those found in the sorrows of young Werther. But as more and more commentators of the last few years have realized, in keeping with this ethos of the Sturm und Drang, age of enlightenment ideals such as rationalism, empiricism, and universalism no longer captures the storm and stress of the human condition. We need emotional extremes to maintain our subjectivity. What I mean by this is hinted at in an article which appeared in the American magazine Science at the beginning of November 1923, the year of Kammerer's visit to both Britain and the US, as well as 2 failed suicide attempts. The article was written by Ivan Pavlov regarding one of his lesser-known discoveries. His experiments showed that the trained behavior in mice, more precisely conditioned reflexes, would be passed on from one generation to the next. Specifically, Pavlov's student Nikolai Studentsov, that's a pretty good name for a student, made mice run to a specific feeding place when a bell rang. In the first generation, it took 300 attempts before the mice remembered the connection. The offspring of the conditioned mice only needed 100 attempts. The grandchildren only needed 30. And the great-grandchildren generation only needed 10 attempts. Pavlov only wanted to test the 6th generation after a stay abroad. However, he assumed that these mice would find food without any attempt to learn. In short, perhaps foremost to the younger listeners of this show, my interpretation is basically that if you feel hysterical in the face of all the shit talking you receive as a generation, remember that the certainties of the boomers and their parents regarding where one finds food for thought are very far from natural. Another enticing thing to keep in mind as we begin our investigation of perhaps the most important socialist biologist of the 20th century is something proposed in an article title of the Irish Times a few years ago, which reads, quote, "Paul Kammerer may have been an honest scientist. Recent re-examinations of his work suggests that he may have discovered epigenetic inheritance, a phenomenon not recognized until long after his death." End of quote. This article was, of course, based on quite a large pool of research into this matter, which has only very recently been acknowledged and allowed. So prepare yourselves now for an Agatha Christie story set to the tunes of the Neue Deutsche Welle like none other.
An der Umgehungsstraße, kurz vor den Mauern unserer Stadt, steht eine Nervenklinik, wie sie noch keiner gesehen hat. Sie hat das Fassungsvermögen sämtlicher Einkaufszentren der Stadt. Gehen dir die Nerven durch, wirst du noch verrückter gemacht.
Hey, 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 ich fahr da goldene Reiter. Hey, 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 ich bin ein Kind dieser Stadt. Hey, 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 ich war so hoch auf der Leiter.
Und dann fiel ich ab. Ja, dann fiel ich ab. Auf meiner Fahrt in die Klinik sah ich noch einmal die Lichter der Stadt. Sie brannten wie Feuer in meinen Augen. Ich fühlte mich einsam und unendlich schlapp.
Karl Tascher begins, quote, "If anyone, apart from the perpetrator himself and the possible client, could know who manipulated Kammerer's midwife toad, then it was Hans Leo Prissibram. The respected biologist was Paul Kammerer's immediate supervisor for almost 20 years at the Biological Research Institute, which Prissibram co-founded in 1902. The longtime director of the institute was considered a scientist of extreme integrity and seriousness and closely followed the career of his closest colleague for many years. In addition, all of Kammerer's major experimental works, which total more than 1,000 pages, were published as reports by the Biological Research Institute. For these reasons, Prissibram, who was 6 years older than Kammerer, had a lot to lose from the forgery scandal. After all, the act that, along with the suicide, caused a worldwide sensation was committed at his institute. If Kammerer himself had been the forger, then the reputation of his laboratory was also at stake. If it had been an employee, it didn't look much better." End of quote. Prissibram was also one of the recipients of Kammerer's 6 well-known farewell letters in which he wrote, quote, "As I am about to throw away the failed life, I would like to thank you again and explain that I actually made my attempts as described. In detail, some things may have been overlooked in situations that I was not up to due to my nervousness caused by a hard life. But I wasn't a forger." End of quote. Clearly spurred by this Kammerer's mentor Prissibram, who was also a Jew, with first-hand experiences of the forces that had been conspiring against Kammerer, barring him successfully from professorhood long before there was any talk of forgery, traveled Europe in his lost friend's tracks trying to find the culprit. But despite his dedication to leave no stone unturned, unfortunately for us and those who have picked up the case before us, he had to confess in a letter to Hugo Iltis, another Jewish socialist who fought against the Nazi eugenicists in the 30s, that clarifying the crucial question of who injected the ink seemed impossible to him. Quote, "This key point is what I and others have tried to clarify so far in vain. So for now, one can only repeat. It has not been proven that Kammerer himself did it, and even less that he did it as a deliberate forgery." End of quote. As our contemporary investigator Tashver notes, quote, "This letter from Prissibram must drive all science historians interested in solving the case to despair, because if even Kammerer's mentor, an immediate supervisor, was faced with a lasting mystery despite all his research, how could the case ever be solved?" However, there is also a glimmer of hope associated with Hans Prissibram. Apparently, the zoologist repeatedly assured in private conversations that he believed he knew who might have carried out the manipulation. At least that's what his brother, the physicist Karl Prissibram, who was an equally respected researcher, remembered. According to Karl, Hans could not go public with his suspicions because he lacked clear evidence. End of quote. And as the first dedicated investigator, Hans Prissibram later disappeared with his wife in the Konzentrationslager Theresienstadt. So too began the memory of Kammerer to fade. The major German writer Thomas Mann was rather unimpressed by the Cold War over genetics, and he instead repeatedly used Paul Kammerer's extensive work Allgemeine Biologie for his work, that is, general biology. But while Kammerer at least found his way into high literature, albeit anonymously, he gradually disappeared from encyclopedias and reference works after 1945. In the 15th edition of the Great Brockhaus Encyclopédie from 1931, there was at least the following entry. Quote, "Kammerer, Paul, biologist, Vienna, August 17th, born 1880, dead 23rd September 1926. Tried to prove the inheritance of acquired characteristics through, within parentheses, sometimes doubtful, end of parentheses, experiments. Kay wrote numerous essays in the quote within quote archive for developmental mechanics, end of quote within quote, as well as general biology and the law of series, end of the quote in its entirety. However, the entry Kammerer, Paul, had been deleted from the completely revised 16th edition, which appeared in 1955. It is also missing from almost all other encyclopedias of the time. If we want to understand why he disappeared, we must look first at the scientific milieu of Wien and Austria in the second and third decade of the 20th century. Kammerer had, by the end of the First War, long been Vienna's most popular biologist, and he was well connected in the German-speaking scientific world. On the other hand, however, there were numerous enemies that the now 37-year-old had made at home and abroad, which was by no means just due to his controversial research. His opponents were also offended by his popular science commitment, social reform activities, his socialist biopolitical beliefs, and his pacifism. Thanks to his involvement in the Monist Association, and being one of 1,044 Viennese brothers spread across a total of 14 free Masonic lodges, he also had influential allies. He was even asked to hold a speech at the Grand Lodge of Vienna about Freemasonry on a December Sunday morning in 1918, the first public demonstration of the Freemasons after more than a century of ban in Austria. But despite all this, and despite towering figures like Ernst Haeckel and Albert Einstein speaking favorably about his work and at times even lent their support to forward his career, Kammerer never became a professor, and it is here that we will begin our investigation. The process began with an expert commission discussing the application in May 1918. Present experts were, above all others, the two full professors of zoology and heads of the first and the second Zoology Institute, i.e. Carl Grobben, a zoological specialist on mollusks and crustaceans, and Berthold Hatschek, who occupied himself with worms and other small animals, which I don't know what they are. They were professors of the old style, which was reflected in the traditional methodology of their research, which was mainly carried out on dead material, and in their reservations about the new experimental zoology. The fact that they both had full beards, as was typical of the 19th century scholars, fits the picture well. Otherwise, Hatschek and Grobben were enemies of each other, which was also reflected in the brief report on Kammerer's dissertation. They were joined in this commission by their two colleagues from botany and the Board of Trustees members, Hans Mollisch and Richard von Wettstein. Mollisch would later teach for a 3-year period in Japan, just as the junta started to take power during the Kanto earthquake massacre on Koreans. And upon his return in the mid-20s, he was made rector of the University of Vienna, a period during which he became increasingly known as one of the big supporters of a new extremist student faculty group known as the Swastikalers. Yeah, you can solve that Sudoku of who they were in your own time, dear listener. Von Wettstein, who had a family of disgusting mold-looking mushrooms named after him, was a proud member of a quasi-secret society known simply as the Deutsche Burschenschaft, the German fraternity, founded in 1888, as well as the Club Germania, another secret society of German nationalists founded in 1908. He would later become a member of the Senate of the Kaiser Wilhelm Society. The Deutsche Burschenschaft would declare in 1933, as their fatherland got a new chancellor, that, quote, what we have longed for and strived for years, and what we have worked for year in and year out in the spirit of the fraternity of 1817, has become a fact, end of quote. And it was these men who, as a commission, would concern themselves with, quote, the award of the title of Extraordinarius to the private lecturer Dr. Paul Kammerer, end of quote. On June 4th, 1918, this committee met for the first time under the chairmanship of Dean Edward Brückner, a geographer from Germany and discoverer of human influence on the climate. Hacek, the worm guy, gave the opening speech at this meeting and justified the application for Kammerer's title based on, quote, Kammerer's research results, end of quote. There was, of course, a certain ambivalence about it. Quote, great talent, but a bit one-sided, end of quote. Rissi Bram then supported his teacher Hacek and, for tactical reasons, even applied for a real extraordinariat for his most important employee at the Biological Research Institute in order to at least secure the title for Kammerer. A lively discussion then ensued. The voice of the critics was led by the briefly in the introduction aforementioned paleobiologist Othenio Abel, who himself only became full professor in 1917 and who flatly rejected, quote, any promotion of Kammerer, end of quote. Abel pointed out that German biologists would doubt the credibility of Kammerer's experiments, that his, quote, experimental facility was amateurish, end of quote, and that his style of popularization was blatant. Quote, even as a teacher at the Cottage Lyceum, he was spicy, but not objective, end of quote. And summing up, quote, he's an advertising person, end of quote. After further discussions, Abel managed to convince the botanist von Wettstein that a separate investigative commission should be set up to examine the allegations against Kammerer. Taschwer writes, quote, significantly, it was Abel who contacted Kammerer's opponents in Germany. It was also the paleobiologist who, before the first meeting, wrote to the botanist Erwin Bauer from the Institute for Heredity Research in Potsdam, who from 1917 also headed the Berlin Society for Racial Hygiene, and the zoologist Max Hartmann from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Biology in Berlin. Both researchers maintained their concerns about Kammerer, but Hartmann's criticism in particular was very personal. However, in their letters that Abel received in June and July 1918, they were unable to provide any concrete evidence of the unreliability of Kammerer's research, end of quote. Yeah, but it says here in the pamphlet from Heinrich Ford that he is planning something. Ja, dann Juden, bitte. Hallo, hallo. After that, very little happened regarding Kammerer at the University of Vienna for several months, but even more so in the world and in Austria. The First World War ended on November 11th, 1918. Tens of millions of humans had become low-cost fertilizers for field poppies in all directions from the high peaks of Mitteleuropa. The defeat of the Central Powers in the war led to the political and economic disintegration of the Habsburg. The House of Austria, which had controlled the Holy Roman Empire since before the end of the 100-Year War in 1440, shrank into a small state. Immediately before and after, profound changes took place. Government power was transferred to the people's representatives, and Austria became a democratic republic for the first time in its history. On November 12, 1918, it was also decided that Austria would from now on be part of the recently proclaimed German Republic. At the beginning of September 1919, this was prohibited by the Treaty of Saint-Germain, which formally regulated the breakup of the Habsburg monarchy into its successor states. The University of Vienna also suffered heavily. Around 600 of their students lost their lives in the fighting, and many more students and teachers sacrificed their health and their belongings for God, the Emperor, and their fatherland. Due to the dissolution of the Donau monarchy, the well-established university system of the Habsburg Empire collapsed. The German-speaking University of Czernowitz was completely, quote-unquote, lost after 1918, and a number of professors had to be taken over to Vienna. Although the German university in Prague existed until 1945, it was no longer as important as a career station for German-speaking scientists as it was before 1914. The subsequent oversaturation of the university job market, in particular, deteriorated the career prospects of lecturers such as professor candidate Paul Kammerer. The sub-commission met again then on November 30th, 1918, to re-examine Kammerer's application and the allegations against him. After Abel had read out the letters from the German biologists at this meeting, Hatschek and Prisibram refuted all points of criticism without objection from their colleagues. The 5-member subcommittee came to the conclusion that the scientific reservations against Kammerer were unfounded. However, this did not in any way speed up the process. On the contrary, it was again interrupted for months. During this time, fed up with the inertia of the nationalists and conservatives of the higher seats of organization, Kammerer and his comrade Leo Spitzer launched an attack on the old regime. Arbeiterzeitung, the daily of the Social Democratic Party, reported favorably from a lecture where Spitzer, as a representative of the socialist university professors, called for the immediate elimination of the old university laws, as they, quote, give some oligarchs, that is the full professors, absolute control over the younger teachers and students. The necessary democratization of the university must be brought about through the participation of lecturers and student delegates in all government activities. Secret diplomacy and bans on public discussions must fall. End of quote. At the same event, organized by the Socialist Association of Intellectual Workers, Paul Kammerer in turn demanded that every professor be required to, quote, work at a community college, end of quote, in order to promote the democratization of science. Where he stood politically had become increasingly clear during the war, and Kammerer had no objection to the attributions, and had now even gone on the offensive. At the end of 1918, he had already responded to accusations that he was a pacifist, monist, and a socialist as follows, quote, 1. Pacifist, someone who wants peace, abhors genocide and state murder, protects his fatherland and other fatherlands from such consuming evil and longs to be liberated. 2. Monist, i.e. one who advocates the scientific worldview, sees God and world, soul and body, mentality and action as a unity, who strives to eliminate every gaping contradiction, every false calculation in his thoughts and actions. 3. Socialist, one who demands equal rights and equal duties for everyone. What scum of humanity! And shouldn't I be happy about being insulted like that? Exclamation mark, question mark, end of quote. When 1919 rolled around, the University of Vienna was almost in a state of revolution, with worker councils and propositions for complete reorganization of its structure, which was met with bitter resistance from the professors led by the aforementioned Othenio Abel. The paleontologist subsequently tried to unite Catholic and German nationalist professors in the fight against his left-wing Jewish colleagues. Abel feared that under the new democratic conditions at the university, the, quote, communists and social democrats would come to power, allied with Jews and Jews again, end of quote. These people, man. He teamed up with medievalist Nordic studies professor Rudolf Muck because of his strong organizing connections to Georg Ritter von Schönerer, one of the most radical pan-German nationalists in Austria, who, funny enough, considering his rabid anti-Semitism, got his Nobel title by working for the House of Rothschild. Fucking idiot. Schönerer and Muck, as well as Abel, were major figures within the Bögbrüders, a secret society also known simply as the Deutsche Gemeinschaft, or German community, which were very busy uniting nationalists and Catholics of all German-speaking universities against socialists, Marxists, Bolsheviks, Jews, Freemasons, etc. Engelbert Dollfuss, the latter federal chancellor and Austro-fascist dictator in the so-called corporate state, was secretary of the secret society as a representative of Catholic students. Much later, right before the Anschluss in March 1938, this society represented the most important intellectual gathering place for anti-Semitic Austro-Nazis. Under Nazi rule, almost all cultural and scientific leadership positions in Vienna were filled by their club members. Over the course of the 1920s, this specialist group managed to permanently damage some careers through infamous denunciations and smear campaigns against Jewish and/or left-wing scientists. The Deutsche Gemeinschaft, or the German community, also maintained close relationship with the Club Germania, mentioned before, and there was a number of overlaps in the people involved. I think we have mentioned 3 societies in total by now, but of course, and it is not the first time I mentioned this on this podcast, we do not know how many overlaps there really were, since they are either secret or quasi-secret. But at the core of this mosaic, insofar that it related to scientific silent diplomacy in Vienna, was something called the Bärenhöhle, the bear cave, located at the Paleobiological Seminar Room in Abel's Institute, in which the collection of prehistoric animals were located, including cave bears. We will return to this secret core in due time, but we can note that as the 20s rolled around, the political front lines at the University of Vienna were clearly drawn. The majority of conservative, German nationalists and Catholic professors had each other enforced against the few leftists. Obviously Abel, Much and the others successfully schemed against making a Jewish socialist a professor, but for the sake of our story as a whole, it's interesting to note that even though they barred him from the title, von Wettstein, whom you will recall as member of many of these Austro-Nazi quasi-secret societies, could not bring himself to declare Kammerer's experiments fraudulent. Quote, "The accusations repeated in letters by Bauer, this is the Salamandra cases, and Hartmann, this is the Alites cases, against Kammerer have been carefully examined by the specially appointed subcommittee using the original objects and publications, and nothing has been found to incriminate Kammerer's bona fide material results. The Commission has therefore concluded that the cases brought forward have been closed, and that these accusations are unjustified." End of quote. No, it seems like the history of the Kammerer case needs us to go to another group of people than the Austro-Nazis, or student organizers of the swastikalers, to find the most vicious forms of extra-scientific methodology, that is slander. Where might we find that? Yes, of course, among the European diaspora of upper-class Anglo-Saxons who first went to the British Isles and then the Americas, and where radioactivity and mutations were becoming the new vogue of biology. Alright, let's see what those fuckers are up to. Without professorship, Kammerer's financial situation and love life just kept getting worse, and he had to continue to make a living through public lectures which often had been held for free, but which now demanded payment. In a letter to an old friend, he describes his reasons for declining an invitation to a lecture at a place called the Free School Association. Quote, "Since the Austrian public is abandoning me to progressive impoverishment, I can no longer make myself available to them free of charge, as I have done so often and regularly, but must try to at least slow down the impoverishment process, using up my father's inheritance. For material but also for moral reasons, it is unacceptable that I continue to serve the general public out of pure idealism, and that the general public uses my services without even the title of a professor, let alone an office that corresponds to my abilities. If things continue like they are now, I'll be a beggar in 4 or 5 years. You have no idea how worn down I already feel. The work continues only as a matter of habit and, as it were, only externally. The smallest new stress test and everything collapses. When the next friend come and torment me with accusations, then I feel thoughts of escapism and imprudence taking shape in me that I thought I had overcome since my puberty." End of quote. In 1923, Kammerer survived 2 failed suicide attempts with sleeping pills which he puked out. But then, in came a favorable article across all 6 columns on the front page of the English tabloid Daily Express, which read, "Wonderful Scientific Discovery," with subtitles as "Eyeless Animals Grow Eyes. Scientist claims to have discovered transmission of good qualities. Genius is inheritable. Transforming humanity." End of quote. The subtitles were all already exaggerating, as is typical of English yellow journalism, but then they even increased in sensationalism. Quote, "On the way to becoming a superhuman. Great discovery can change us all. Genius is hereditary. Eyeless animals grows eyes." End of quote. A few weeks later, the New York Times had an almost full-page report on Kammerer's research that led to extraordinary headlines. Under the title, "Scientists Report Success Where Darwin Failed," it read, "Eyes developed in Olmen shows that acquired characteristics can be inherited. Laurels of the Austrian scientist. Evolution would accelerate if the best characteristics can be transferred." Tashver, our investigator, asks how was it possible that the Viennese biologist, who had already given up his experiments on the inheritance of acquired characteristics and his hopes of a university career, was suddenly discovered in Britain and US newspapers in the spring of 1923 as the new star of biology. He then goes on to paint an interesting backstory to these tabloid sensations, telling us that this brief media triumph goes back to a trip that took Kammerer to England and Scotland at the end of April. He was invited by the Natural History Society, a group of zoology students from Trinity College, University of Cambridge. The students' interest in Kammerer stemmed primarily from the fact that there was a simmering conflict between 2 of the leading British specialists surrounding the Viennese biologist. While the geneticist William Bateson, a former professor at the University of Cambridge, represented strictly neo-Darwinian positions, being one of the fiercest critics of Kammerer's work, the neo-Lamarckist Ernst MacBride was considered its passionate defender, although he was politically far to the right and believed in the superiority of the white race. The students hoped that with Paul Kammerer as a guest there would be a clarification of positions, or even better, a spectacular showdown between the 2 opponents. Another reason was that Kammerer would bring his controversial specimens with him to England so that the British colleagues could get an idea of their authenticity and significance. Bateson in particular had still not been convinced by Kammerer's Allied's article from 1919, and the photographs presented and demanded further evidence. Which isn't hard to understand, since Bateson was the first person to use the term genetics to describe the study of heredity, and the chief popularizer of the ideas of Gregor Mendel following their rediscovery in 1900 by Hugo de Vries and Karl Correns. MacBride also wanted this and therefore sent the zoology doctoral student Judah Hirsch Quastel to Vienna in the summer of 1922, who took a neutral position between Bateson and MacBride. Quastel should also explore whether Kammerer would be willing to come to Cambridge, giving a lecture and bring the controversial specimens of the midwife toad with him. The young researcher's visit was successful. Quastel experienced Kammerer, quote, as an extremely kind person of integrity, end of quote, and also received the additional photographs requested by his English colleagues. Before the official invitation was issued, Kammerer was made an external member of the association on December 20th, 1922. Again, that is the Zoological Society in London. In mid-March 1923, Kammerer reported to his friend Harry Benjamin in New York with obvious pride about the upcoming trip and acceptance into the learned society. Quote, "These honors are obviously a consequence of re-examinations of 2 of my papers that were recently carried out in England and in full confirmation of my results." End of quote. A month later, Kammerer went to London and Cambridge as one of the first scientists after Einstein to come as a member of the Central Powers to the land of the victorious. As promised, he had the most important specimens from his experiments in his luggage: the specimen of the midwife toad with the rotting culluses, the cave olm with the eyes and the color-changed fire salamanders. Now many of you, dear listeners, might suspect that this historical period, 3 years before it all ended, must be an extremely interesting period to look into, should we want to pose a deductive question regarding a supposed fraud. And indeed, the first detective of our case, Arthur Koestler, goes looking in his 1970s book The Case of the Midwife Toad, which popularized the mystery for precisely this deduction. That is to say, he wanted to find clues through extensive research as to whether this specimen of the midwife toad, which turned out to be quote-unquote improved with ink in 1926, had already aroused suspicion during the assessments in England in 1923. Koestler based his presentation on some contemporary reports and letters, and in 1970 he also interviewed some of the scientists who had been eyewitnesses to Kammerer's lectures in Cambridge and London, and who had examined the preparations that they had brought with them. He found out that the first lecture on April 30th in the anatomy room at Cambridge University had been well received, and he also found out, interestingly enough, that Bateson had refused to show up. Why, we might ask. People who were present remembered the visit with quotes such as, quote, "gave the impression of an honest, open-hearted man who took a passionate interest in his experiments and was willing to have them checked by anyone at any time," end of quote. Another one says, "convinced of his honesty." Even a member of the Bateson camp, Muriel Weldell Onslow, said, quote, "his personality made a positive impression on me throughout," end of quote. Furthermore, Onslow told Koestler that William Bateson's son, Gregory, who was named after Gregory Mendel, and later an important anthropologist, applauded loudly after Kammerer's presentation and shouted, "You'll be able to handle it." Seriously, dear listeners, what the fuck is going on here? Some people were embarrassed by the aforementioned Yellow Press articles that followed, probably even Kammerer himself, who was used to a different kind of pop biology in the continental world. But the American press at least interviewed and quotes some of those present, such as zoologist John Stanley Gardiner, who said that, quote, "Kammerer begins where Darwin left off," end of quote. And the biologist George Nuttall claimed that Kammerer, quote, "perhaps made the greatest scientific discovery of the century," end of quote. After Cambridge, he went to Scotland, but the highlight of the trip came on May 10th in London's venerable Linnean Society, the oldest natural research society in the world. And by the way, me and my cousin are right now writing up a complementary Unlocked series that will hopefully run parallel to the Patreon Lysenko episodes, precisely about Carl von Linné and how the deranged Swedish creatures of Arctic darkness kick-started this whole scientific racist shit show in the 1700s of taxonomy. We are born in the same city as this curly whitelock after all, and have been forced to visit his grave and garden too many times for us not to share some stories from our ancestors with you guys. Anyways, at the Carl von Linné Society, Kammerer repeated the Cambridge lecture, and this time the hoped-for showdown did take place, because William Bateson decided to show up. Now, despite the drama, the neo-Darwinists and the neo-Lamarckists' frontiers did not move an inch. In the official report, only a brief statement by Bateson is documented, who actually congratulated the speaker on his enthusiastic dedication to his work, but did not agree with some of his conclusions. According to an article in Nature by McBride, you remember Bateson's adversary, Bateson had apparently also withdrawn his accusation of quote-unquote intent to deceive and apologized to Kammerer for previous attacks if they were too harsh. Takes an Englishman, right? You're a fraud! Actually, I'm so sorry. What? But this does not mean that all is well in dandy England of gentlemanliness. For as soon as Kammerer left the Isles, Bateson began complaining that he suddenly wanted to take a closer look at the specimen again. What gives, Mr. Bateson? Is someone else pulling the strings? In Cambridge alone, Kammerer had made his specimens available for detailed examination the whole afternoon before his lecture, and again a day or two afterwards. For this purpose, the Allites' specimen were also removed from the glass container, which Kammerer, as he wrote in a letter to Nature, of course would have done also for Bateson. Bateson went on to seemingly enjoy the cat and mouse game over the toad and promptly offered £25 if the Allied specimen would be sent from Vienna to the British Museum in London. For comparison, Tashver, the investigator, tells us the total cost of Kammerer's trip, which was financed by donations from professors at Cambridge University, was just over £16. And the zoologist most recently earned the equivalent of £150 a year. So basically he's offering him 2 months' salary. Kammerer, who didn't personally own the specimen, referred him to the Board of Trustees of the Biological Research Institute, where its director, Hans Prissibram, declined Bateson's offer, but in return invited Bateson to Vienna to take another close look at the specimen on site or to put it under a microscope. But nothing changed when Bateson doubled his offer to £50. The toad stayed in Vienna, Bateson in London. It's even more interesting to note that when Julian Huxley, many years later, elevated his anti-Lysenko campaign to UNESCO, many of Bateson's old colleagues were interviewed regarding Kammerer and made false statements about what had happened some 30 years earlier, in which these respectable seniors now claim to remember, quote-unquote, for example, quote, Kammerer showed the specimen in a glass cylinder, and McBride just glanced at it for literally a few seconds, then handed it to me. I passed it to Bateson, who looked at it with magnifying glass, and then said to me in a whisper, "That looks like a smudge of black ink to me." Fuck off. Tashver again comments on this upper-class British bullshit. It sounds as if there had already been a concrete suspicion in England, which was then confirmed. But one has to assume that, in this case, Cannon simply pieced this story together 36 years after Kammerer's visit to England, and 33 years after the ink dyes were exposed. Because, in the sentence after the next, there are two major errors that indicate how unreliable Cannon's memory was. Quote, how right he, Bateson, was became clear just a few months later, when it was shown in America that the preparation was a fake. End of quote. But the discovery of the ink did not happen in the USA, or a quote-unquote few months later. It's 3 years later. Apart from the question of whether this preparation was fake at all. It cannot be completely ruled out that Kammerer's midwife toad was manipulated during his visit to England, but it's highly unlikely. The main argument in favor of Kammerer, which is difficult to refute, is obvious. The Viennese zoologist would hardly have taken a fake specimen with him to England, since he had to expect that his greatest enemy would inspect it closely, and that any fraud would be exposed. I mean, this was the whole point of him going there. How retarded do you think he is? Instead, the trip has a relieving effect, considering the consistently good and unsuspicious impression that Kammerer left with almost all British eyewitnesses of the time. And, you know, how they did talk about it back then, not 36 years later when, well, you know what's gonna... Well, actually, we do not know everything that's going on then, but we're getting there. not a single researcher complained that Kammerer had in any way hindered the study of his specimens. Kammerer himself also seemed very happy after the trip and wrote to his friend Wilhelm Bölsche, who is considered by some the father of nature conservation and an early proponent of non-elitist people's science. Quote, "Recently I was in Cambridge, Edinburgh, London, and felt actually for the first time in my life that I was well treated. Maybe and hopefully 1924 will bring a trip to the new world." End of quote. And indeed, on to new adventures in the US of A he went. On November 27, 1923, Paul Kammerer arrived in New York's harbor on the steam ocean liner Resolute of the Hamburg American Line. The ship would years later be sold for scraps to Italy, but was instead repurposed as a transport ship by Mussolini in the Abyssinian War, before being damaged beyond repair during the ruthless bombings of Naples, which was carried out by both the British-American Northwest African Strategic Air Force and the Luftwaffe. The purpose of this trip was completely different. In Cambridge, Kammerer had reported to a scientific audience about his own experimental zoological studies from the time before the First World War. In the USA, he was supposed to give a lecture on his Viennese colleague Eugene Steinach's spectacular rejuvenation experiments, and not only in front of experts, but in front of as many interested people as possible. The trip was arranged by the old friend Harry Benjamin, a German doctor and endocrinologist who emigrated to New York and who would become a pioneer of research into transsexuality after 1945. A grand entrance awaited the Austrian in the recently nicknamed Big Apple. There stood zoologist emeritus and founding president of Stanford University, David Starr Jordan. As many others, a fanatical racist eugenicist, but uniquely involved in a murder mystery of his own concerning the poisoning of the name behind the university, Jane Stanford. The reception committee also included Paul Bartsch, a German immigrant who was now a big name at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History in Washington, as well as Samuel Lampert, the former Dean of Medicine at Columbia University in New York. Being of the Lamperts family, which as I understand it is a very old European family that made it big as bankers for the Rothschilds during the Napoleonic Wars. In the background were numerous other prominent representatives of science, but also clergy, such as the Unitarian John Haynes Holmes and the Rabbi Nathan Kras, who also welcomed Kammerer. Of course, a reporter from the New York Times was available to speak with Kammerer upon arrival. The report that appeared the next day left no doubt that a real pop star of biology had arrived in town. In the subtitle of the report, Kammerer was once again described as Darwin's successor, who would carry on where Darwin stopped. Funny enough, one of Kammerer's first observations contrasts itself a lot with our general contemporary picture of fatso New Yorkers. Quote, "I watched the American at his meals. This specimen eats far too little. I don't believe in gluttony myself, but even during the worst times of wartime famine, the Central European ate more than the average New Yorker." End of quote. More seriously, he also noticed, as was the case, that as a result of the First World War, New York and the USA as a whole had begun to overtake the metropolises of Europe. This was also reflected in the rapid development of universities and science. In 1923, Columbia University in New York became by far the largest university in the world, in terms of students, followed by Paris. Of the 10 largest universities in the world, only those came from the United States. 10 years earlier, the ratio had been reversed. In 1913, only 2 universities were among the 10 largest universities in the world, namely Minneapolis and Chicago, in 9th and 10th place. The war and its consequences had a particularly drastic effect on the University of Vienna. In 1913, it was the 4th largest university in the world, but in 1923-1924, it was only ranked 26. The rise of US universities went hand in hand with advances in research, which were particularly great in biology, and their trends of an Indiana methodological new social reform, which we are beginning to know too well by now on this show. For you see, one man who was not at all pleased with the publicity of Kammerer, who made a show about not showing up, was big friend of the podcast and Lysenko. I'm talking, of course, about Rockefeller's ace scientist Thomas Hunt Fruitfly Morgan. And of course, his Drosophilias of the Fruitfly Mafia looked much more impressive, modern, effective, and fast-paced than Kammerer's already old-school choice of amphibians. But I have to say, with preliminary observations about the history of ideas of evolution, as suggested in the intro, frogs and the middle creatures of the light years that separates ocean and land are far more historically interesting than the buzzing nuisance that are the pests of rotting bananas. But then again, oil and steel oligarchs with interests in tropico-colonial trade are paying for the orchestra, and never have so many, for example, collected art, without the slightest sense for the finer things in life. As Morgan confided to his English colleague Bateson in a letter, Kammerer was at least a kind of indicator of who among his colleagues was on the quote-unquote right side of neo-Darwinism and Mendelism, and who was on the wrong side. That is, that of the acquisition of acquired characteristics and the mechanism of so-called somatic induction propagated by Kammerer. The fact that new genetic information in the germ cells came about through new information in the body's cells, which in turn was based on new environmental stimuli, as is increasingly revealed as a biological truth by a new generation of epigenetic scientists today, seemed at this time increasingly untenable to US geneticists, the patrons of whom were often very involved, if not single-handedly the perpetrators of an environmental destruction more rapid than the combined efforts of ages and civilizations gone by. Thus instead, Morgan chose to act behind the scenes as an influential puppet master against the Viennese zoologist, whom among the older US zoologists still had numerous followers, rallying a younger generation of researchers, which had long since turned away from the neo-Lamarckian questions of environmental influence and towards the concrete mechanisms of inheritance and the carriers of genetic information. Yet poor naive Kammerer, isolated by war and economic crisis, believed erroneously that, quote, the majority of American biologists did not yet believe in the inheritance of acquired characteristics, end of quote, when the opposite was the case. Many no longer believed in it. This was indicated upon his arrival at the annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which took place in Cincinnati in early 1924. As a result of Thomas Hunt Morgan's interventions, Kammerer was not even invited. And as the botanist Daniel T. McDougall, then General Secretary of this largest scientific society in the world, emphasized at the end of the conference, the Anglo-American biological doctrine, that is world science, would speak out against Kammerer. Meanwhile, back in the secret hallways of Europe and silent diplomacy, as Kammerer was busy admiring all that New York had to offer, Abel, our paleobiologist, proudly reported to his friends that, quote, I have welded our anti-Semitic groups at the university so tightly that we form a solid phalanx. This work is perhaps just as necessary as making books, end of quote. The secret clique of the Bear's Cave, whose existence, I should add, was only discovered a few years ago, great thanks to Tashver, went on to erect a Siegfried's head in the auditorium of Kammerer's alma mater in November 1923, a memorial with anti-Semitic connotations for the university's war dead, which alluded to the Dolchstoß legende, according to which Jews and socialists would have stabbed the army in the back. At the inauguration of the Memorial of the Fallen, National Socialist students stood in the front row. In the meantime, Abel's secret bear cave clique had begun its anti-Semitic interventions at the Faculty of Philosophy. The first victim was the aspiring physicist Karl Horowitz, who wanted to complete his habilitation in 1923. At the commission meeting at the end of November 1923, everything went according to plan for him. The expert committee unanimously declared him scientifically qualified. However, the historian and bear cave participant Heinrich Zrybik, the only non-specialist member of the commission, wanted to know whether Horowitz was a communist, which was truthfully denied by the physicists present. Nevertheless, 2 weeks later, a text appeared in the Deutsch-Österreichische Tageszeitung, the early propaganda paper of the National Socialists in Austria, in which the quote-unquote Aryan majority of professors was called upon to prevent the habilitation of the communist Jew Horowitz. A day later, the professor voted, and the physicist, who was actually a social democrat and non-denominational, promptly received 34 no votes and only 20 yes votes, failed and emigrated to the USA a short time later. In April 1924, under the title Race and Science, all teachers at the University of Vienna who were of Jewish origin were listed for the first time in a German-Austrian daily newspaper. The same yellow list was also available in the form of a leaflet. The message was obvious. There are too many Jewish teachers at the university. These are their names. Their courses are to be avoided or, if necessary, disrupted. Thanks to a parliamentary inquiry by Social Democratic MPs and reporting in left-wing socialist and communist media such as the Arbeiterzeitung, there were pushbacks and delays to outright bans. But it did not matter. Scientific darkness was creeping back over the lands of Europa. By now, a vote among the Nobel Committee, the highest esteemed prize of bourgeois science, had come to the concluding erection of the State Institute for Racial Biology in Uppsala, the first of its kind, supposedly. Aryo-heroic mythology was now world science. Evidently so, since so many of the clinics they instituted for this purpose all over Sweden carried names of Old Norse gods. Their laws of forced sterilization would, in Sweden at least, remain in jurisprudence until 2013, targeting Romas, transsexuals, schizos, and work-shy leftists in general, throughout the preceding century. Paralleled by so-called discoveries of genetic reductionism that gave them authority, and an authority which in turn they bestowed upon these scientists with the Nobel Prize. Fruit Fly Morgan fittingly got his in medicine in 1933 by our Nazi king in Sweden, just as Reich President Paul von Hindenburg gave the National Socialists the Reich Chancellor title. If this feels a bit loopy, the Nobel reproduction of scientific authority, then the continuation of the eugenical flat circle jerking after the war is an even starker indication of this. Since the Endlösung der genetischen Frage proposed by Rockefeller, Kellogg's, Carnegie, the Kaiser Wilhelm Gesellschaft and the Galton Society of Britain had shown no indication of actual improvement of the mental Germanic stock in the many decades after 1945, even though they had, according to some statistics, managed to sterilize or gas every single psychotic, that is 100%. Statistics which do keep me up at night and made me scream for my lungs when they belted me with magnetic locks and put the needle to my skin against my will in the isolation rooms of the quasi-British private asylums of Hong Kong. Only Aktion T4 managed to reach vollständige Fertigstellung. Yet the new generations of Germany were mentally sicker than others, which begs the question, what had they inherited outside the explanatory models of genetic reductionism? What they and Richard Dawkins in his February 16, 2020 tweet forget when they say that eugenics actually works is that the conditions, i.e. the social environment that need to be put into place to cut people to pieces against their will to save the stock of a particular race, is in itself so harmful and schizophrenic and so traumatic that the whole project can only be described as the ignorance of the epistemic impossibility of perpetual motion. You know, the infinite machine, which even Leonardo da Vinci ridiculed them for in 1494. Quote, "O ye seekers after perpetual motion, how many vain chimeras have you pursued? Go and take your place with the alchemists." End of quote. Of course, I wouldn't tell Dawkins that if I met him. I would just slap him in the face, break his stupid little glasses that he insists on taking on and off in pathetic gestural objection to what he sees as subhuman stupidity during public discussions. And I would let him know that I deserve to live. I deserve to reproduce, even though in my blindness I engaged in Rassenmischung. But then again, Dawkins, you will eventually go down in history as nothing but an old, sad man, increasingly scared of death. Isn't that why you keep, despite your atheism, herald the traditions and cultures of Christianity? Huh? It's so pathetic. I mean, you must realize it. But back to the story at hand. When the old-timers retired in 1925, Othenio Abel managed, in Kammerer's absence, to outmaneuver his mentor, Hans Prisibram, whom we know will end his days in Czechoslovakia and Bohemia's first KZ. Abel put his own family member, a poorly qualified Dutchman, in the head seat, a good-for-nothing moron who would later join the Dutch National Socialist movement, which helped opening the gates for the much heralded Blitzkrieg during the war, which in my opinion is more a story of deceit than military technical history. Anti-Semitic machinations had reached even the zoological department of Kammerer's alma mater. Because, dear listeners, they wanted to stop the Jew from turning the fucking frogs gay, and now even dinosaurs was the topic of Nazi politics. It's also telling to see how some of them tried to reproduce Kammerer's experiments. While the socialist himself had painted his jars in different dark colors to study the effects of light on the specimen, his areo-heroic colleagues gouged out the eyes of the amphibians. Because that's just the kind of breeding stock they are as a people. Kammerer, seeing Jewish leftist colleagues being banned from science upon his return, retreated to the Werting Castle near Offenhausen in Upper Austria for a summer writing retreat and relaxation. This former refuge for scientists, philosophers and artists had belonged since 1921 to his close friend Wilhelm von Gutmann, who had the old building furnished with valuable furniture and paintings, supporting among many the anti-bourgeoisie familial theories of Sigmund Freud. The castle had once also been the temporary home to such inspiring figures as Pau Casals, the great Spanish and Puerto Rican cellist who wrote the anti-Franco soundtrack of the times, vowing never to return to Spain until the fascists had been thrown out. I promise you, dear listener, you will never listen to Bach's cello solo No. 1 the same after hearing him in Saint-Michel de Cuxa Abbey. The man was an anti-fascist composing genius. Even John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson realized it. Kammerer's daughter, Lacerta, who was also allowed to spend her summers in the castle, remembered that she had never heard anything like it before and that she listened breathlessly to his playing. He time and time again vowed for his concerts to be donated to anti-fascist causes, and in his mid-90s, in the 1970s, at a concert he held a speech in front of the General Assembly of the United Nations for Catalan independence. That is before Franco had died. Quote, "But let me say one thing. I am a Catalan, today a province of Spain. But what has been Catalonia? Catalonia has been the greatest nation in the world. I will tell you why. Catalonia has had the first parliament, much before England. Catalonia had the beginning of the United Nations. All the authorities of Catalonia in the 11th century met in a city of France, at that time part of Catalonia, to speak about peace. 11th century. Peace in the world and against war. The inhumanity and brutality of war. This was Catalonia. I am so happy, so moved to be here with you." End of quote. And I think this is where I will have to leave you for today. I thought naively after many discarded scripts that I could tell you about Paul Kammerer in a single episode. Such an undertaking, even a summary, is impossible. For as Hegel said, a sum is just a sum. To some of you it might seem like a shut down case already, which it also did to Arthur Koestler, whose aforementioned investigation in the 70s, the case of the midwife Toad, had William Bateson down as the most likely culprit. But as Tashver notes, Though theoretically possible, there is one major problem with this hypothesis, because Bateson died at almost exactly the same time as the manipulation of the Allites' specimen was discovered. So if you join me next time, we will have to take things even deeper. And fortunately for us, Kammerer had one more trip to the Americas in store. And secretly, so had some members of the Bear Cave. So, let's wonder for now what they might have gotten up to. Allow me now to end things with some Sturm und Drang, a poem by Austrian archaeologist Johann Gabriel Siedel, who also wrote Gott erhalte Franz den Kaiser, an ode to the last Austrian Caesar. Not because I'm a fan of Caesars, Kaisers, Tsars, or even Austria, though I did spend some of my best days there living in a beautiful castle turned into a student dorm, an innocent period of my life with one of my best friends. Happy summer days of river rafting, which would give even the sound of music a run for its money. Longboarding down the Alps covered with flowers, visiting the local clinic once a month with bruises. No, not due to such nostalgia of the impotent who would associate the tender freedom of their youth with the Führerprinzip, but because this more sober poem by Johann is entitled Widerspruch, or contradiction. And you know, I take every opportunity to work on my German, having been told by a meager group of Diendel lovers that the Swedish-German accent is quite sexy, which I'm quite sure it isn't. Wenn ich durch Busch und Zweig brech auf beschränkten Steig, wird mir so weit so frei, will mir das Herz entzwei. Rings dann im Waldenhaus rücken die Wände hinaus, wölbt sich das Laubgemach, hoch mir zum Schwindel, ach. Webt sich der Blätterscheier, jedes so schwinge mehr, dass sich mein Herz so weit sehnt nach Unendlichkeit. Doch wann in weitem Raum, hoch am Gebirgesaum, über dem Tal ich steh, nieder zum Tale seh. Ach, wie beschränkt, wie eng, wird mir's im Luftgedräng, rings auf mein Haupt so schwer, nicken die Wolken her, nieder zu stürzen droht, rings mir das Abendrot, und in ein Kämmerlein seht sich mein Herz hinein. Now I'm sure I made a proper fool of myself, so for my own and the English listeners' sake, in the proper language of the new empire in the age that knows only war, when through bush and branch I strike out for the narrow climb, it becomes so wide for me, so free, that my heart nearly bursts in two. Around this forest house then, the walls recede, and a leafy chamber arches high above me. A roof of dizzying height, nearly every leaf is interwoven into a wing for me, so that my heart yearns deeply for infinity. Yet when in wide spaces high on the mountain edge, over the valley I stand and gaze towards it, oh, how restricted, how narrow it becomes for me in the oppressive air. Around my head so heavy, the clouds nod down, threatening to crash down. The sunset surrounds me, and in a little chamber does my heart long to be.
I haven't played in public for nearly 40 years. I have to play today. This piece is called the Song of the Birds. The birds in the space sing peace, peace, peace. And the music is a music that Bach and Beethoven and all the greats would have loved and admired. It is so beautiful, and it is also the soul of my country, Catalonia.